been a long time coming. Struggles to make America better, to make justice for all a reality. Now America looks different. It's time for a new politics. America already has a progressive, multiracial majority, a new American majority. We have the numbers to reshape American politics, to elect presidents and senators, not in 2044, not 10 years down the road, today.
There is no topic, I think, especially this year, that is a bigger deal than how we're going to deal with the demographic changes in the country. It is giving everybody fits in politics and media and some of our families. And it's good sometimes to have somebody who has more than an opinion. I spend a lot of time talking to people who have opinions, some of them better than others from my point of view. But we're going to hear for about 10 minutes from Steve Phillips. You may not have read this book yet, but I guarantee you there's some books that are before and after books. You saw the world a certain way before you. You may have had somebody, but you saw it before and then you saw it after. Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, is a before and after book. This is one of those before and after books, and I'm proud to bring Steve up for a couple of reasons. One is he's not just an author. This is a guy who's been on the front lines of a lot of these fights for decades. When I knew him back in the 80s, he was fighting against apartheid as a young student. He was in 84 and 88 a part of the Rainbow Coalition sticking up for Jesse Jackson back when it was weird to have a black guy talking about hope running for president. That was weird 20-some years ago. And I remember when he was on the school board in San Francisco fighting for justice as a young elected official. And he's somebody who, from a movement perspective and from a party perspective, has seen up close the way that race and politics mix and don't mix well in our country, and certainly in the Democratic Party. And so his book has this weird stuff in it called facts. It's amazing. Statistics, so he got demographers, statisticians, map makers to get together and reveal some stuff that I think is going to be a surprise to everyone, and then we're going to have a great conversation about it. Bring up to the microphone the good brother Steve Phillips, author Steve Phillips. All right, brother. Appreciate it.
Thank you, everybody, and thank you, Van. It's been quite the journey back in the day in the Bay Area and working on these issues, just trying to fight them forward. And now here we are in this august halls of Ford Foundation, where Van will be heading off to be doing his national TV stint, and things move forward in that direction. And I want to thank Martine and Eric and the whole Ford Foundation family for putting this together and bringing together this conversation. And it's been quite the whirlwind, just rolling the book out, and so you kind of contact everybody and you call everybody, and I was like, Eric, we got a book, and think about something we could do, and then you put the people in together, and next thing I know is like all of this, and so it's really just it's very gratifying, but also I think it does speak to the fact that there is this moment, and there are real things happening in our society, and there really is a significant opportunity for us to grapple with these different types of issues. And I also, you hear the words a lot around this election about this existential threat. And I was thinking the other day, I was like, what does that even mean, right? And so I actually went to look up the definition of existential, and it is what it sounds like, that the question of the existence of an entity is at stake. And I really do actually believe that is in fact what is before us in 2016 in the country and within both of the political parties in terms of what direction we're going to move forward. And the fundamental question around the existence is, is America going to be a white country, or is it going to be a multiracial country? And so the existence of America as primarily and fundamentally and initially a white country, that is what hangs in the balance in terms of existentialism, in terms of the existence of what that concept is. And so from the time that the first English settlers set foot on this land in 1607, the definition and the understanding of this country has been as a white country. And you see that in the laws that the colonialists put forward in the pre-Revolutionary War period. One of the very first laws created in the United States was the 1790 Immigration and Nationality Act, which says to become a US citizen, you have to be a free white person. And that was good law until 1952, and it was the practice of this country until 1965. And so there are cases from the 1920s where Asians wanted to become US citizens and went to the US Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court says, no, you can't, because the law says you have to be a white person. And so this notion around us being a white country is long-standing. And that all went up to, and that changed profoundly when the world changed profoundly in 1965, where you had the civil rights movement cresting, you had particularly the Selma to Montgomery March, the Selma struggle. And one of the things I didn't even fully appreciate in terms of all of what had happened at that time period was that after the Selma to Montgomery March, after the LBJ was moved or forced to give his speech introducing the Voting Rights Act and saying we shall overcome, the next day he gathered his top staff together and says, I want to do a whole bunch of things. And one of those was the Immigration and Nationality Act, which took down the whites-only sign on entry into the United States. And so from that time period, and this is why I try to root much of the historical context for my analysis in the civil rights movement and the Selma to Montgomery March and what Dr. King was putting forward, the country has changed from 12% people of color in the 1960s to 38% today. And so this has been the profound demographic revolution which is facing the country right now, and which also is making much more possible. And that my central argument in this book is that we now have a new majority coalition, a new American majority, where the cornerstones of that are the country's growing communities of color. And that those communities, in partnership with progressive whites, who are a discounted and underappreciated element of the population, and there's so much focusing on the conservative whites and the conservative white working class, there's very little appreciation for the progressive whites. And I say in the book, can't we show them some love, right? And so, but we have this majority. And so it's a majority which elected, and then even more importantly, re-elected Obama. And so Obama got 5 million fewer white votes in 2012 than 2008 and still was able to win election because the composition of the country had changed so much. And so along with that majority and along with that new leadership and that new president and that new direction, we've had a whole bunch of public policy changes. We have universal health care. We have the executive action for the Dreamers. We have a whole different relationship with countries around the world and a level of respect for all the different countries in the world. And the question then is, what direction are we going to go in? What direction are we going to go in? This is what we faced in 2016 in terms of public policy and in terms of the direction around what the composition is. But I think it comes back to this question around this existential question. Are we going to move forward to fully embracing and becoming a multiracial country that celebrates and includes the full totality of the diversity of the country? Or are we going to go back to actually being a primarily white country? And I do believe that that's the challenge that is faced for the country overall and for each of the political parties. And that we have this phrase and this hats in this election around Make America Great Again. And so my question is, well, when exactly do they think America was great? And what was the status of people of color and women and LGBT and religious minorities at that time? And so it's clearly an attempt to move back to a period where the central identifying principle of the US was that this was primarily a white, male, heterosexual Christian country. And that is on the table for people to vote on in this election. And so I think for the country, that hangs in the balance. Clearly it's a question that the Republican Party has to grapple with. And then, very interestingly, they had, after the 2012 election, put forward this growth and opportunity report, referred to as a Republican autopsy, where they said quite explicitly, we have to embrace and reach out to and include people of color. And they have done a lot in terms of elevating. Republicans have done more to elevate statewide candidates of color than the Democrats have done, actually, over the past 8 years. And yet then you have Trump coming in with a whole different direction. So they face their own existential challenge around what direction they're going to go. But it's also a question for the Democrats, in that there is a very serious question, which is really the fundamental motivation for me to actually write this book, around, are the Democrats going to fully embrace enthusiastically and unapologetically the new American majority in the communities of color which comprise that? And I have a chapter in the book called Blinded by the White. And it is this notion, because the country has been so fixated on and has so much had a obsession with prioritizing and giving preference to whites, that there's this disrespect for it. It's talk about old habits are hard to break. I mean, you don't get to a situation where 95% of the leading roles on television shows are white without active white preference. And given how bad TV is, you can't claim that it's meritorious, right, in terms of people having that. And yet this notion around who are the people who are talented, who are the people who have the capacity to lead, infects the progressive movement overall and the Democratic Party overall. And as I've been doing this work where I'm really looking at the leadership of the progressive movement. So Obama's voters were 46% people of color. Yet the leadership of the progressive movement overall, and the Democratic Party in particular, is still overwhelmingly white. And the more that I've been digging into this, the phrase keeps coming back to my mind of apartheid. I mean, it really is almost an apartheid-like situation where all of the top leadership positions, with very few exceptions, are controlled by whites in a party that is nearly half people of color. And so this is the existential challenge facing the progressives and the Democrats. Are we, in fact, going to invest in, embrace, elevate, and promote the full diversity and people who have the expertise and the knowledge to be effective? And we're starting to see some of these changes take place in the society overall. Listening to an interview the other day with one of the head person for the show Empire, one of the top shows on television across the board. She says all of the writers are black. And all the writers are black because they want an authenticity and they want a specificity that speaks to the audience. And then because they have that, that actually works. So that notion around the cultural competence that's necessary to be successful in a multicultural society starting to take place in different areas, but not taking place broadly in the progressive movement. We did an audit of Democratic Party spending in looking at 2010, 2012. Out of $500 million of contracts that were let, 97% of them went to white consultants in a party that's 46% people of color. And so the Democrats face this threat in the progressive movement overall. It's not just the Democrats. I think it's across the board. A lot of the Ford Foundation grantees, I think we all have to grapple with this in the philanthropic sector and social change sectors. What does that leadership look like, and does it come from, and are we elevating it? And then that then gets tied to the issue around what the policy agenda is and how we move forward on our whole policy piece. Is that I talk in the book about what we call the tyranny of the white swing voter. And that throughout history, there has been capitulation and surrendering our highest values and our greatest beliefs and our strongest principles out of fear of what the white swing voter will tolerate. And that goes back to Thomas Jefferson taking out the references to slavery in the Declaration of Independence, to Abraham Lincoln reassuring the white swing voters that while he was a supportive of ending slavery, he did not believe there should be equality between blacks and whites and that whites should be on the top. And I would argue it goes all the way up until the past few years, where there's been this reluctance to fully embrace and own healthcare reform, because that goes to too many poor people of color, to fully embrace immigration reform, because out of fear of what that will do in terms of embracing the white swing, in terms of will offend the white swing voter. And so I think my fundamental message, right, is that there is a new American majority, and that we can move from what had been defined for the existence of a white country to a multiracial country, and that we have the numbers to do that. And that progressive people of color and progressive whites together, if you use the metrics of the Obama re-election, and apply that to the entire eligible voter population, is 51% of the entire country. And so if you truly believe that we have this majority, we don't have to be held hostage by the tyranny of those voters in the middle, and we can put forward bold, aggressive public policies confident that the public will embrace that. And we are seeing that start to actually take place, and that we can move forward and start talking about the racial wealth gap in this country and looking at the historical and contemporary realities around why that actually comes to exist, that the average white family is 140,000 in assets, average black family 10,000, average Latino 11, and even the Asian population, which has many more immigrants in it, it's only at 75,000. And so there is this profound racial wealth gap, which is rooted in the history of this country and perpetuated by current public policies. And we start to get to that kind of a policy discussion, then we can look at things such as the wealth gap. The top 1% in the country has $26 trillion in wealth. And if we instituted a wealth tax, not an income tax, but a wealth tax of 2% a year, we could end poverty within this country. So my fundamental message, and I conclude the book with talking about, the conclusion is called From Fear to Hope, and that we're seeing a tremendous amount of fear in our society and through this election and these rallies and these protests and what's going on. But we've seen this in California, where there was the demographic changes elicited great fear, but then moved forward once we embraced the new majority to having much greater hope and much greater possibility. And so we've been able to move forward to polluter pays tax. We've been able to move from 3 strikes and anti-immigration to being able to have to taxing the wealthy, and then most recently just putting forward and signing the Fight for 15 law for $15 minimum wage in California, which the governor did not want to sign, but it was on the ballot, and he knew that this new majority was going to vote for it. So although it's a crazy time in this election, and that I think that is evident every day, and Van gets to comment on television every night, I think my fundamental message is that it gets better, that we have the numbers to be able to move forward to make this better. We've seen this with the Black Lives Matter movement moving from protest to power to taking out a district attorney in Chicago and in Cleveland. And that we can actually move forward. We have the numbers, if we will believe it, to move from the prior definition of our existence of a primarily white country to a multiracial country rooted in the principles of justice and equality. And I genuinely believe that that is within our grasp, and that we can move forward to that in the next few months and the next few years. Thank you.
I was deep. That brother said apartheid in the Democratic Party. I said, Lord, it's about to get deep up here. So we're going to bring the panel up. And we're going to have a conversation. I got some questions for you, brother. But let's give Steve a round of applause. We're going to bring him back up on the panel. Come on back up here. And he's not going to be by himself. We have an all-star panel. We also have Deepa Iyer from the Center for Social Inclusion. Give her a big round of applause. Going to have Tamara Jacoby. She is a CEO, and she's from Opportunity America. She's going to be on the panel. And then we're going to have another great author, the great Ian Haney Lopez of Dog Whistle Politics, another before and after book. Y'all can sit down?
We're supposed to sit.
It don't matter. I'm over here on the far left. Oh, I don't mind at all. You know they was streaming that, brother. Okay,
I'm sure my Twitter feed will.
So let me do a follow-up question to you, because you got facts, statistics, data. You said what percentage of the DNC's budget goes to white consultants? Or what's the percentage of white consultants who?
It's 90. The number we have 97% of the dollars went to white consultants.
97%. Now, what is the percentage of African Americans who have to vote in the presidential for the Democrats to win? Is it 50%?
Oh, it turns out the actual turnout.
Yeah, what the African Americans have to give what percentage of our vote to Democrats for the Democrats to win in the presidential?
Well, if you use the Obama metric, it was 93%.
Well, hold on a second now. So you trying to tell me that if we give 70% of our vote to Democrats, Democrats lose?
Yes.
80%?
Probably.
90%?
Well, they need 90% for us to win.
So we give them 90% of our vote, and yet less than 3% of the consultants?
People of color, not just black.
Not just blacks! So here's a tough question. Is the Democratic Party a racist party, or are black people stupid people? Because one or the other.
So
I said it's not going to be sanitary. I said it wasn't going to be sanitary.
So it's not enough that I say apartheid. You want me to know?
Well, first of all, why is that, and what's the cost of that? What bad decisions get made because of that?
So I genuinely believe that the progressive movement overall, Democrats in particular, are wasting hundreds of millions of dollars.
Hundreds.
This cycle. So Democrats spent $2.7 billion last cycle. 46% of their voters are people of color. By logic, close to half of the money should go that direction. So the one example that I use in the book to illustrate how the misapplication of the funds is that North Carolina was the top Democratic priority in the 2014 race, trying to protect Kay Hagan in that race. The outside group, not even the party, the outside groups, the environmentalists, the labor unions, et cetera, spent $19 million just on negative TV ads. And so no one's ever argued that that's designed to increase your turnout or increase civic participation. And she still lost. That same $19 million could have paid for 400 full-time staff people going door to door, making phone calls for an entire year. And if each of those people had just gotten 3 voters per week with 2 weeks off for vacation, she would have won that race. And so the mindset around the most important voters are the white swing voters drives people to then gear their policies and gear their spending towards trying to influence those people rather than trying to invest in the organizations, institutions, and leaders in the communities of color to get out that vote.
So it's deep. So if you had $19 million, the dumb way to spend it is on ads trying to push down on the white vote. The smart way to spend it is investing in organizing on the people, but we didn't do that and lost North Carolina.
Exactly.
I want to bring you into this tomorrow. Tomorrow, you're a Republican.
I'm proud of it.
Why don't you just come and get all our votes? Because I think we might need to start looking around and dating some other people. When you hear these kind of conversations going on among Democrats, an almost apartheid-like structure, and you think to yourself, as somebody who's been fighting for more inclusion in the Republican Party, how does this strike you, and what's preventing you from getting our vote, and why should you get our vote?
Yeah, so reality check, right? It's April 2016. There's this guy running for president who's become the magnet for all the racial resentment in the country, right? And he's up there. We all know about him. We all know how he talks. There's another wing of the party, and there's a struggle coming. The struggle's not going to happen before the election. But as Steve points out, we have a bunch of candidates. The moment that captured it for me was that moment in South Carolina where you had Rubio and Nikki Haley and Tim Scott standing there on the stage, and I said, I hope that is the face of my Republican Party.
That looked like a Neapolitan sandwich. It was like ice cream. That was amazing.
And it was not fake. It was real. And those people, and it's not just an image, right? Because we do have a lot of people like that. We have the people that weren't on that stage. Susanna Martinez and Brian Sandoval, and guess what? Paul Ryan, he's white, but he is in the camp of knowing that it's not an existential question. He knows America is going to be a multiracial, and it has to be a multiracial, inclusive country. There's a whole wing like that in the party, and they It works to it. They attract Latino votes, certainly. They don't attract as many African American votes as they should. But, from George W. Bush down through Jeb through last cycle, people like Sam Brownback and Greg Abbott were in the 40, 50, 60% of Latino voters. And the people in the party are changing. Look at young Republicans' views of immigration compared to older Republicans' views of immigration. But we're going to have a struggle. We're going to have a fight.
What are the arguments? Look, I'm here. Pitch me. Yeah. After this, I'm available. I'm telling you, I didn't know until I read the book. What are the arguments? What do you think are the 2 or 3 strongest arguments that a Republican Party could make to be more attractive?
Well, I think, okay, we got a long way to go, right?
Sure.
I'm not pretending we're there yet. But the arguments are about, the answer is that small business and education and asset ownership and education and training, that we're going to be better at coming up with answers for people that aren't just about, excuse the phrase, identity politics answers, but we're going to come up with some solutions. And that are solutions that, I'd like to see solutions that work for the daughter of the Latina cleaning lady in Los Angeles and the son of the out-of-work steel worker in Ohio. And, I would like to see some real solutions coming out of the party. It's going to take, again, a fight, and probably we're going to have to lose, because we're going to have some good ideas, and Trump's going to have to go down in flames, up in flames.
The amazing thing to me is, I've been African American for a long time, and a lot of the stuff that you say is actually sounds like my dad. A lot of us got parents and grandparents that when you talk to them, they're not saying please don't get a job. They're not saying, please rely on the government. We have a lot of it. They're not saying don't go to church. They're not saying don't go to the mosque or synagogue. There's a strong faith piece. There's a strong entrepreneurial piece. But answer me this. It seems like you guys come and bring us this bowl of soup. And it's got some real good policies in it and some poop. And you keep saying, well, look at all the good policies. It's hard to drink the soup with the poop. How are you going to get the poop out your party?
Yeah. That's one of the better questions that's ever been asked. Yeah. No, we are gonna have to have a fight. I mean, there's no question. We got some ugly past for way too long. We not only tolerated some real bad stuff in the party, we milked it. We benefited from it. And we're going to have to come to terms with that. And it's going to have to be more than just, some photo ops. But I think the real place that the payoff's going to come if we come up with some good ideas, some solutions.
Yeah, gotcha. Well, I really was impressed with Paul Ryan. We'll come back to some of that stuff. But let's go to you, Deepa. We've been talking about parties, and that's a key thing here. But parties are made up of people, and parties are impacted by movements. And some of this racial resentment and racial anxiety is actually whipping up movements that are impacting parties. You know a lot about that. When you hear this conversation, how do you think about it from a movement perspective?
Yeah, well, I think that we have to really temper the excitement that a lot of us have about the racial demographic changes with some hard-nosed optimism and reality checks, right? I grew up in Kentucky as an immigrant in the mid-'80s, so I'm really excited about these demographic changes. But at the same time, I think that people of color and immigrants should be vigilant about some of the narratives that we're already starting to hear. And we've talked about them a little bit already. But what often accompanies changes in our racial landscape is the narrative of othering, this erosion of rights, right? Taking away the rights and benefits of people of color or immigrants and refugees who are seen as invading and taking over the perceived majority status of some folks. And studies bear this out, right? So we've seen, for example, that when some whites are polled and told about these changes in demographics, their positions on policies actually become more politically conservative, especially when it comes to issues around race policy. But we're also seeing it in more pernicious ways in terms of that erosion of rights. So I'll just kind of give you an example of some communities I work with, South Asian, Muslim, Arab, Sikh communities in the state of Tennessee, right? So Tennessee is a state that has seen these dramatic racial demographic shifts. Asians and Latinos are the demographic drivers there. Nashville, fastest growing immigrant city in the past decade. Largest Kurdish refugee settlement in the country, right? But along with all of that, over the past 6 years, we have also been seeing anti-Sharia laws being introduced, English-only laws being introduced, pushback on the obstruction of a mosque in Murfreesboro for years and years and years, right? Blocking Syrian refugees. So both the political rhetoric as well as the legislation that we're seeing in places like Tennessee are connected to this racial anxiety because the demographics are shifting. And with Muslim, Arab, South Asian immigrant communities, it's the racial anxiety plus the Islamophobia plus the xenophobia all coming together. And our communities have been at the crosshairs of that. And what is shifting that is movement building, right? And so we see this time and again that we have to invest in and support and cultivate movements of people who are directly affected in order to push the political parties to actually respond to us rather than curry their favor. So we've seen this, for example, in terms of the immigrant rights movement, right? I think about, you might remember when President Obama was giving a big speech on immigration in San Francisco in 2013, Ju Hong, who's an Asian American undocumented youth from this group called Aspire, actually interrupted him and asked about the fact that his parents, that he hasn't been able to see them in years. Now, what Ju did was a moment, right, in a long movement of undocumented youth speaking up and putting their bodies on the line. But a year later, we got DACA, DAPA, right? Policies that we never thought would be possible. The same with the movement for Black Lives. We now have political parties and candidates actually carving out positions on criminal justice and police brutality that I don't think we saw in 2008, right? So that movement has made it inconvenient for political parties to ignore what is happening in the Black community. And what's interesting about these movements is that they are multiracial. There are young people that are part of it. They use lots of different types of media and social media, and they're also directly affected folks. Yep. And so I think that that is the way that we push parties and candidates to respond, by investing in and cultivating these social change movements.
Well, let me get you. Well, yeah, you clap for that. Awesome. Clapping is allowed. Well, let me get Ian Haney Lopez in here. Obviously, if you haven't read Dog Whistle Politics, that's another before and after book, because he really decodes a lot of the kind of subtle messaging. Of course, we're now gone from dog whistle to megaphone when it comes to racial language in the country. How does this conversation strike you, and what would you add or subtract from what you heard so far?
Well, I really want to foreground the role that race is playing in the Republican Party and what that means for Democrats in a way that I think goes to Steve's thesis. Listen, the Republicans cannot get identity politics out of their basic pitch. That's all it is, right? It is a basic formula that says to white voters, take all your anxiety about demographic change, all your fear about these different faces, your resentment about press one for English, your sense that you're embattled through affirmative action, and channel that, and this is important, channel that not just into votes for Republicans, channel that into resentment of government. Mm-hmm. Into resentment of government, because if you can get people to take a resentment of minorities and turn that into distrust of government, that allows the plutocrats to seize the levers of government and the levers of the marketplace. It allows them to say, there ought to be massive tax cuts for the very rich. We ought to cut all those social service programs that are for scheming minorities, though it turns out they're the social programs that build the middle class. And also, we ought to get government out of the way of the marketplace, deregulate the marketplace, which is code for let corporations write their own regulations. That's the basic formula that Republicans have been pursuing for 50 years.
Oh,
Donald Trump is not an aberration. He is the personification, the epitome of this politics. What do we know about him? He's leading by scaring people about Mexicans and Muslims. And yet, in terms of substantive policies, other than banning people and building a wall, what does he propose? Massive tax cuts for the very rich, tax cuts so extreme it would take us back to tax levels we last saw in the 1890s. This is dog whistle politics, and so this idea that the Republicans are going to pivot, no, they're not going to pivot. Yes, of course they have a few non-white faces, but nevertheless the GOP is 98% white in its officials, and it depends upon 90% of its voters are white. And actually I should say that non-Hispanic white. There's now another 6% who are Hispanic, but I guarantee you, those are Hispanics who think they're white. This is a party that's drawing roughly 95% of its support from whites.
Okay. I'm gonna throw the flag. Wait.
Okay.
I'm throwing the flag. Wait. Calm down. Get some water. Okay, now look, I gotta
I want to connect this up with Steve now.
No. Hold on. Oh, Lord. Okay, Lord. I need my Republican sister to have at least.
So, it's just not true. Trump is not, there are a lot of people in the party who hate Trump. The establishment is trying to stop Trump. Republicans believed in the market and limited government since we got here 200 years ago. That didn't start when there started to be a lot of people. That didn't start as a way to channel racial resentment. That's something people believe. People actually believe that government stomps out what happens in families and in communities and the good energy in the market. It's not just about the market. Republicans actually believe that a strong government blocks all that stuff and gets in the way of it and crowds it out. And they've been for limited government and more civil society and freer markets for 200 years, right? It's not just about race.
Let me ask you a question.
Yeah.
So first of all, I think you're right. Let me just say that.
Thank you.
There's a philosophy, before we get to political strategy, there is a philosophy prior to race that has a view in your party about the proper role and arrangement of family, individual, state, and market. And it is wrong, and would be wrong, to say that view is in and of itself a racist view. It's a view prior to race. But there is something called history, and there is something called strategy, and there is somebody called Richard Nixon, and there is something called the Southern Strategy.
Yeah, of course.
So you went from a party that was focused on liberty, right, liberation, anti-slavery, to something that to a lot of people looks like the opposite. Help us understand your view as you try to narrate. How did that happen, and how do you undo that?
Well,
because from a strategy point of view, he's exactly right. The strategy now to get to that view is profoundly, as he says.
Yeah, but again, there's a party is a coalition, right? And there's some people who drove the Southern strategy, and there's people who are still driving racial polarization strategy, and there's some other people who have a very different idea, but still believe in markets.
And I'm going to bring you back in, but your view is that Ian's view of the Republican Party is too reductionist and simplistic, and it doesn't allow for the contradictions within this coalition.
Exactly.
And your view is that there is a wing of your party that's trying to rise that could perform differently. So I think that's a strong challenge to your view. Are you being reductionistic and unfair to your Republican sister?
I think I'm describing 50 years of history. And let me also be clear about conservative philosophy, because the modern Republican Party, the Republican Party today, does not espouse conservative philosophy. It is not a party that believes in increasing people's liberty, that believes in slow but steady change, that recognizes the importance of cultural evolution but seeks to preserve traditional institutions. It is a party instead that is geared to rationalize shifting power to the very wealthy. And it's enormously destructive. And there's one moment in 2012 that really crystallizes how anarchic and anti-conservative the modern Republican Party is. And that's when Mitt Romney is caught on tape saying he doesn't care about 47% of the country. That's not conservatism anymore. That's a form of reactionaryism that says we're all about the rich and powerful in society, and we'll say whatever we have to say. But at the end of the day, the policies we enact are going to transfer more and more wealth to the rich and powerful. And really, we need to pause for a second and say, what has happened since 1970 up to 2014 in terms of shifts of wealth?
So I will make sure you get a shot at this, but I'm watching Deepa. And I think Deepa might have an opinion about some of this.
You need to let me back.
Good. We'll towel you off. We'll get you back with your gloves tied back on. But Deepa, how does this all strike you?
Well, I just, again, want to kind of move us from the political parties to policies, as you were talking about, right? And I wanted to connect up with something that Steve talks about in his book, which I think is very important.
Let her then get back and make your point.
Okay.
and then we'll move on.
Totally fine.
So I'm not going to do he said, she said,
Go
because
ahead.
that could get really boring.
That's good.
You're wrong, I'm wrong, you're wrong. But let's just talk about what we think is going to be in the best interest of people of color going forward into the 21st century. I would say it's not going to be one victorious brown and progressive white party versus a dwindling old racist party. It's going to be, you have a stake, everybody in this audience has a stake in my side of the Republican Party winning and the two parties being competitive for people of color.
Now wait, this is a radical view. Wait, hold on a second. Now hold on. This, let's get some clapping. There are two different views on this stage. Sitting next to me is a brother who just wrote a book that's a pathway for the victory of a new majority, progressive whites, progressive people of color, with a vehicle called the Democratic Party. He says that's a pathway to better policy, better outcomes for people of color. You say it's a disaster.
I say
Why would that be a
old
disaster?
adage taken for granted by one party and ignored by the other party.
So what's
We've
the
seen
alternative
that,
view?
It's
What's
been
the
history for the alternative is two parties competing perpetually into the future. I've got a better idea for you. No, I've got a better idea for you. That's how we're going to advance.
So you believe that there's a danger that maybe a party might give, a group might give, say, I don't know, 92 to 93% of its vote to one party, and then be taken for granted. Interesting.
Hey,
Deep.
have we watched that?
That's never happened before.
Yeah,
Deep.
no, I hear what you're saying, Tamara, but I guess I don't really believe that either of these two political parties is really beneficial for people of color, period, right? So because when you look at the policies that both of these political parties have enacted, they're usually on the backs of, and they disadvantage people of color and immigrants. And Steve lays this out really well in one of the chapters in his book when he talks about the racial wealth gap, immigration, and the like. But what has happened, let's take, for example, both immigration and the war on terror, right? These are policies that have actually ended up trying to court white voters, that the white voters that are leaving, perhaps, as you were talking about, but again, on the backs of people of color, right? So when we talk about securing the border or securing our bodies against terrorist activities, what we're actually also doing is, what the parties are doing, is implementing these really law and order kind of frameworks in order to, again, surveil Muslim communities, right? Or to set up this national security infrastructure that is all about, quote, violent extremism, which equals someone who's Muslim or South Asian or Arab. And so at all points, these sorts of policies that are supposed to be courting white voters to return, or perhaps in the Republican Party to this group that you were talking about, at the end of the day, the policies are disadvantaging communities of color and immigrants. Unless the parties start speaking to our communities and start to actually be responsive to us, I don't actually think that either one of them are going to get our votes. They're not competitive. They're not speaking to us. And that's why we're pushing on the streets and in the systems.
So, I mean, that was dark. That made me sad. I'm hopeful that Steve,
You can bring it back.
is there any hope for either of these parties? What's the pathway for the Democrats to be worthwhile?
I mean, let's not fail to appreciate what has happened, right? In that we have this continuum. We had Selma to Montgomery. People gave their lives, risked their lives to create the right to vote, to be able to transform the immigration policy. The country has been trained so much that an African American could be elected president, and then that African American could pass, for the first time in the history of this country, universal health care. So 18 million people now have health care within this country. And so which benefits people of color and which benefits people across the board. Unemployment rate has been cut in half. Unemployment rate for each racial group has been cut in half. So this coalition presents the opportunity and has made tremendous strides. And so my argument, the only issue is that I would have in terms of this issue, so I don't dispute that each of the parties has not been as beneficial and has exploited the different communities of color. But I feel it disempowers us to talk about it that way, in that it's the parties and that's the. I was at an event in the Bay Area, you'll appreciate it. So somebody was saying that people who come to like city council meetings, they don't see themselves as the protagonist in social change. They see the protagonist as somebody else. And so we talk about the parties, it's like these other people over here are doing these things and making these positions. The Democratic Party, I'm sure the Republican Party piece worse, but the chair is election. You can run somebody to actually be the chair of the Democratic Party. We have the numbers to be able to actually be, my argument is we should be taking over these parties and then transforming them and putting them in service of the communities of color.
Well, Ian, this brings me back to you. There's one view that says the pathway forward is that we need to make the Democratic Party better, and one way to make it better is to have more people of color preferred when it comes to outreach, when it comes to policy, when it comes to organizing. I want to ask you about that because you may have a different view. First of all, what do you think is the cost right now of maybe being afraid to talk about race? So let's be honest. Right. You have some Democrats still who get very uncomfortable with Democrats talking about race. What's the downside of that? And then what's the downside of going too far and talking only about race?
Right. So I want to be clear, there is a political conversation about race and identity that is going on all the time, and it is largely couched in dog whistle terms, dog whistle politics, dog whistle terms, coded terms like illegal alien, like terrorist, like thug, but also silent majority, homeland, hardworking Americans,
real Americans.
Real Americans. These are code, right? This is a conversation about race. But on the progressive and liberal side, there's been a real resistance to actually surfacing that conversation and having it expressly. Because liberals have seen that conservatives respond to them by saying, see, liberals just talk about race all the time, and liberalism is really about giveaways to minorities. Come vote with the GOP. Right? And so the lesson that the Democrats have internalized is, let's not talk about race. Let's not do too much for people of color. Or indeed, in the Clinton years, let's engage in dog whistling ourselves. Let's change welfare. Let's crack down on crime. Right? And so coming back to Steve's point, I couldn't agree more that a durable progressive coalition depends upon the Democratic Party reaching out to people of color, if done right. And if done wrong, we'll lose that opportunity. And so what's the difference between right and wrong? If all we do is reach out to people of color, that's tremendously dangerous because what it's doing is it's feeding into the conservative line that the Democratic Party is really a party of giveaways to minorities. So what we have to do is we have to combine this greatly enhanced attention to the concerns of people of color and at the same time link that to a set of policies, a vision progressivism that speaks to whites, right? And I believe we can do so. And I think it's very simple to do so. I think what we're saying is we are all in this together, whatever our color. And only in dealing with racism and in refusing to be divided by color and by immigrant status, only then can we take our country back from the very rich who've largely hijacked it. That combination, to talk simultaneously about class and race, that's the key.
Now, I bet you agree with that, not at all. So.
No, well, okay, but see, I think we don't have time to do it now, but we should have a conversation about did welfare reform help people of color or not? I mean, a third of the people who are on welfare now work. I think that's a good thing. And I think there's a bipartisan agreement that it's better to have a system that's based on getting people to work. I mean, that's a long conversation. We're not going to have that today.
Let me ask you a question. Is it true that
it's not just about color?
You're smarter than I am. Is it true that a third are working, or is it true that a third are off welfare?
A third are working.
Is that true?
Yes.
Okay, good. I'm glad to hear that.
It wasn't just. I mean, I'm defending Clinton now,
yeah,
right?
Good. From Ian to Steve.
It wasn't just a racist act. It was a bipartisan act that actually helped. It was a Republican act. Clinton drove it. It was a bipartisan act where Clinton and Newt Gingrich did it together, and it ended up helping people of color, millions of people of color.
So look, here's the deal. There may be some people are anti-poverty in this room or something. That sounds like somebody here may have some. So here's the deal. We will have Q&A. And are we at that time? Well, we're at the Q&A time. So here's the deal. Isn't that amazing? We're going to move to Q&A, but I think you have a much more radical view than you shared. No, I do. And I want to give you, because I know you a little bit, and I want to give you a view. Part of your discomfort with this whole conversation, I imagine, has to do with your discomfort with the imprisoning ideas of racial identity and racial tribalism itself. Speak to that before we go to Q&A.
Okay, so never mind my ideas. Look
Yeah.
what's happening in the country, right? 10% of people of color. No, it's actually 15% of people of color are intermarrying every year. Newlyweds, 15% of them are people marrying out of their group. For Latinos and Asians, it's 25 to 30% are marrying out of their group somebody else. 10% of the babies born in a given year were mixed babies. By the third generation, 20% of Latinos and 40% of Asians don't identify. And you can say that's bad. You can say people are avoiding their color, or you can say the boundaries of race are getting blurred. And personally, I think that's a good thing. I think tribe is really important. Tribe has given meaning and power to people for a long time, or purpose. But some people want to transcend it or make it less important in the mix. And I think we want to be a country where people are free to be their tribe or free to put it lower in their priorities.
So I'm going to give Deepa a chance to respond to that and move on. But listen, I think that sometimes this is a point of real confusion and missed opportunity across these partisan lines. There's some people, they don't use the language of the left's anti-racism, but there's an anti-racialism that we may sometimes overlook, underestimate, or scoff at that may actually give us a basis to work together and hear each other more. I just wanted to make sure to pull that out. Deepa, you get the last word, then Q&A. Now, but you may want to push back on some of this.
You're right. So maybe it's true that there will be this transcending, as you say, right, of racial boundaries and racial classifications, blurring. Okay, but the bottom line is we can't transcend the system of racial oppression and hierarchy that exists. And so even if that occurs, we still have to invest in social movements. We have to invest in the democratic process, in the political process, right? In order to actually take away, dismantle that system, which is really founded on anti-Black racism and which affects Indigenous communities and other communities of color. So as we shift and as we change, we have to have our eyes on the ball, which is about dismantling that system of racial oppression together.
Hey, can we give a round of applause to this panel? This panel. Well, you said you didn't want to be antiseptic. I don't think it was no septics up here. So anyway, so we have about 8 minutes for the Q&A. Is that right? And somebody will tell me. So it's going to be short. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to have 3 Qs, 3 questions, and questions have question marks at the end. But there won't be any answers, okay? We're going to get 3 questions on the table, and then we'll give our final statements and answer them as we close.
Great.
All right? So, first question, and stand up and let us see you. And you got 3. They said 30,000 people are watching. By the way, give a round of applause to the people who are watching on the stream. Don't be nervous, but tell us your name.
Yeah, I'm Jaren, and I've been an organizer in the immigrant community. I'm Muslim and married to a wonderful white man, but that doesn't take away the fact that I am still a Muslim woman of color. So you said 1/3 of the people who were taken off welfare are now working. I worked with an economic justice organization. They're not only working, they're working poor. Mm-hmm. So how do you deal with that? That's my question.
Good. So one question about the working poor. Michael?
Hi, I'm Michael Lithcott. I think you mentioned something from the book that's very powerful, the tyranny of the
White
swing voter, silent majority swing voter. And that can be an idea that might linger far beyond the demographic saying that it's actually rational. So I'd love to hear the panel's view on what would be the reality in both parties if the perception was that swing voter was a brown voter, or now I think some of the rhetoric is maybe Latino Americans may become that swing voter, and talking about the viability of 2 parties that now instead of fighting for a, silent majority swing voter, we've done with that for 200 years. What if that swing voter is a brown voter?
Very good. Thank you, Michael. Last question.
Hi, this has been a great, lively discussion and timely because I've been thinking about Chairman Ron Brown, who died 20 years ago this week, and I've known Ron very well. So my question for you, Steve, is something that Ron started years ago to really demystify the party, be inclusive, one of the reasons I got involved in the party. And so you made a remark to say, we collectively elect a chair. And so I'd like to hear your roadmap to how we do that, because obviously we've been disappointed currently in the leadership that we have. Thank you.
Very, very good. So the way we're going to do this is we're going to start at that end, and we're going to swing down, and we're going to give you the last word since you're the star of the show, and it's your book. But I feel like there might be one more question. Is there somebody else just so mad they didn't get a chance to ask it? There she is. I knew you were out there. Here we go.
Hi, I'm Stephanie. I'm one of those multiracial Americans that y'all were talking about. Hi. So what I wanted to ask about, because I read your book, Steve, it was amazing. I'm here to have it signed. But you really don't necessarily talk about us, right? Those who may identify as multiracial. You did mention Kamala Harris, and you mentioned her actually in the Asian American chapter, talking about the demographics, right? And in that sense, I was like surprised, because normally when you have someone who is Blasian, you oftentimes, rule of hypo descent, you automatically categorize them as black, right? So we don't necessarily get to choose how other people identify us, right? Especially in the electorate. So I was wondering how you speak to multiracial Americans and when self-identity doesn't necessarily align with that of what the party identifies you.
Oh, suck it now. I know Steve was like, why you got to get that fourth question? It was going great. What's your name, sis? Steph? Stephanie. Thank you, Stephanie. So look, we're gonna go whichever one of these you want to hit. And if you want to add anything, add it. But there's free food and stuff later, so don't get carried away.
All right.
Ian.
So I want to pick up on the questions that swirl around categories and multiraciality, and I really want to pick up on the first word in the title. Brown is the new white. This is a book that I think could easily be misunderstood. It could be easily misunderstood to say, hey, demography alone has saved us. Right? Because let's look at the numbers. People of color, the numbers are going up and up and up, and we're just going to lump them all together. I think that'd be a tremendous mistake. And we see the mistake in this conversation about categories. Part of the insight of Brown is the new white is that non-Hispanic whites will be a minority of the country in 2043. Non-Hispanic whites. If you include in that category of white Hispanics who consider themselves white, then in 2043, whites will be 72% of the country. They're 62% now. We may be in a period not in which whites are becoming a minority, but in a period of rapid expansion of the white population, right? And what that means is that if we're going to have a politics that really tries to build on communities of color and progressive whites, we're going to have a very sort of intentional, purposeful engagement around class, around plutocracy, but especially around race, and I would say around the core notion of whiteness. Right? Because it's whiteness, this sense that lighter is better, that darker is dangerous, right? It's whiteness that's so dangerous, and whiteness does not know categorical boundaries. It doesn't care if you're mixed race. It doesn't care if you're light-skinned. Listen, among Afro-Latinos, apparently it doesn't matter if you're Afro-Latino, because a lot of Afro-Latinos identify as white, right? So that's, I think, that what Steve's putting on the table. Build this new coalition, but build it purposefully by really systematically engaging race, engage whiteness, and then connect it up, I would add, connect it up with how race has been used to bamboozle so many of us into supporting plutocracy.
Ian Haney Lopez. Dog whistle pop. they have drinks here? So, anyway, Ian Haney Lopez, Dog Whistle Politics, available on Powell's and Amazon. Get your book. Now to you.
So I wanted to address a couple of the questions around how political parties are maybe not speaking to multiracial voters, or you talked about the brown swing voter. So two points I wanted to make around that. One is that, you know, when you think about Asian Americans, for example, right, oftentimes people have this perception, and it's true with polling, that Asian Americans tend to vote Democrat more so. But in many elections, we have been swing voters as well, right? But again, as I think I keep repeating myself, the way to speak to Asian American voters or any sort of swing voter is on the issues, right? And that also means that political parties cannot be afraid of talking explicitly about race. I completely agree with Ian about that. Race, class, all of the different intersectional identities that we hold. That is absolutely important. They can't shy away from it, and they can't actually gloss over it by using words like diversity and multiculturalism, right? Has to be about inclusion, access, and justice. And then the last point I quickly wanted to make, because I don't think we got into it, is that it is going to be it's important also to realize when you talked about, you know, 2043, that no one minority group is going to be the majority, right? It's all minority groups being the majority population in this country. But that also means that we need to get our stuff together, and we need to figure out how to actually get along, have messy conversations about race ourselves, right? So, because a lot of times we are pitted against each other. And so I want to lift up, you know, groups like BAJI, Black Alliance for Just Immigration, where they actually have conversations with Black immigrants and African Americans about Latino and Asian immigrants, right? So those messy conversations about what are our shared fates, what are our shared futures, and how do we actually transform our society rather than just transact with one another, right? So that has to be part of this coalition that we are building as people of color and immigrants as well.
Very, very good. Hey, listen, give a round of applause. Deep, I want to do two things. One is you are also an author. I can't brag on your book yet because I haven't read it yet, but you are also an author. We Choose Sing America. So get that on Amazon and Powell's as well. But I want to impose on you, there was a question around the working poor. I know, given your work, given your background, there is this idea that if you just push people off of public assistance and dismantle a lot of the social safety net that may be entangling them, that they're going to all go be great. And that was raised, and I just want to make sure that somebody with your background might be able to respond to that a little bit.
Well, actually, Steve mentions this in his book, that, you know, that there's this myth, you call it like a profound myth, that you can attain the American dream and that there is no need for any sort of support systems, right? And we have seen, you know, since the 1990s, actually the dismantlement of the federal safety net, not necessarily, you know, welfare reform or immigration reform that has helped people of color or the working poor. But that particular myth, I think, especially affects, I'll speak about Asian American communities in particular, right? Where we're often used as sort of this, quote, model minority to show that, well, you know, certain Asian Americans don't need benefits or certain entitlements, quote, right? And they can make it, so why can't, you know, other, say, Black or Latino people? But again, those are the sorts of racial wedges that are used to prop up that system of racial oppression that I talked about. And I think it's very important that we see through that dog whistle politics and those policies and actually demand policies that actually work for our communities and will build our economic and political power.
Okay. Thank you very much. One more time for Deepa. Appreciate you being here. So tomorrow you can respond to a whole range of whatever you need.
So, well, I mean, I think the first thing I want to respond to is our conversation before, because I 100% agree with you that the blurring of racial lines, as much as I welcome it, is not the answer. I mean, that's the beginning of the story. That's the reality out there. We still have to have politics and policy and politics. Politics first and then policy. And, you know, this is exactly the working, let's take the working poor, right?
I don't, again, it's a caricature of the Republican position that just says, let's take away the safety net and that'll be the end. I think this is where a lot of the ideas from the thinking Republicans, I don't know, we don't have a label yet, but my wing of the party, this is exactly where they live, is around the where the issues are, is around the working poor. And it's less about government than it's about skills, and it's about asset ownership, and it's about home ownership, and it's using the forces of the market and the forces of competition to help the working poor. I mean, again, we're going to differ about whether those are good ideas, and we could spend all day here talking about that. But that's so.
And to your point, Jack Kemp is someone that nobody would have accused of being a racist. He was probably more comfortable around African Americans than other people of color than half the Democrats. To your point, and you have in Paul Ryan, the Speaker of the House, someone who sees himself as at least in that tradition.
The most powerful Republican in the country, dare I say.
And he just gave a speech in where he specifically repudiated himself for saying makers versus takers. In the 2012, he said there's some Americans who are makers and some who are takers, which a lot of people rightfully took offense to. He specifically, Paul Ryan, and you got to applaud people when they do the right thing, came out and said that was wrong and it was offensive, he shouldn't have done it. He also specifically has reached out on the question of criminal justice reform. And so there is a wing in your party that is trying to figure out a way to square those original principles and a philosophy you can reject or accept, it has nothing to do with race, and trying to figure out a way to scrape some of the racism off of it. And I appreciate you for being one of those great people.
So
you have more to say, but go ahead.
Well, let me just say the last word is you framed it so nicely, and I didn't. I think we are on the same page. Brown swing voters. I mean, that's the future. That's got to be the future. We're never going to get to real answers unless we live in a world where people are looking for people of color as swing voters. That's, and so I think, you all have a stake in my side of the party winning a fight. Don't ground us into the ground. we need to be there being competitive, because otherwise we're going to have more of what we had, which is the quote-unquote progressive party taking for granted and ignoring people of color.
Very good. Tamar, really good. Really, really good. And then we're going to give the last word to you, brother. From Ron Brown to multiracialism, you got a lot to cover.
So maybe 4 quick points. So one is that I want to applaud Paul Ryan and the work that you're doing. I am hopeful. I think it would be a very good thing. And if we were genuinely had people in both parties grappling with the question around what are the best policies to address issues like poverty, I think that would be a very good thing. I admit I'm skeptical, and I'm skeptical because of the past X number of years but if that were the case, and if Paul Ryan were sincere, that would be very good. And so I hope that is something that's coming on the horizon. Just real quick, issue around multiracial, and then a little bit what Ian was saying, maybe suggestion to Ford is to look at an initiative around the census and the census categories. And the census categories are a mess. And there's a book that was written by the former head of the Census Bureau saying, what race are you? And he talks about how illogical actually a lot of these categories are. And so this whole question is a question to me around, are Latinos actually identifying as white, or is there a very messed up form that the only thing they can check off actually is white in that context? And so it's a whole big thing, the whole issue around how do we categorize people from Middle Eastern countries, so all of that is it's a mess, and it's something which would benefit from some significant Ford Foundation funding to participate in that debate.
Right. With Democrats and Republicans.
Yes. So just the last 2 points I want to make are around the issue around Ron Brown, this moment in the Democratic Party.
Who is Ron Brown?
Ron Brown. Well,
Who was Ron Brown?
Ron Brown was a significant African American political leader who was the Commerce Secretary, who was the chairman of the Democratic Party in 1993, and who was on the plane which crashed in...
No, 93. He was Bill Clinton was elected.
Clinton elected in 92. Didn't he appoint him? Didn't he win the chairman?
Fine. Early 90s. Go ahead, brother.
Early 90s. But Ron Brown, a number of other people died in this plane crash in the mid-90s. But which is to my point around this, he was the convention chair, the convention manager for Jesse Jackson in 1988. And so he went from that work with the Rainbow Coalition to then the Democratic Party to being chairman of the Democratic Party. Howard Dean ran an insurgency campaign from a state called Vermont, where there's another candidate running an insurgency campaign, ran for chair of the party, took over the Democratic Party, implemented a 50-state strategy. That's the type of thing that is, I believe, as a Democrat, within our grasp. And the challenge, though, is to take all that energy, those resources that drive, connect it up to the communities of color, and then transform the institutions within this country. That is a possibility. I think that's a very real possibility. Something should be thought about very seriously and strategically in the context of this year. And then what that leads us to, I guess, is my last point again, is that if we really believe deeply that we do in fact have a majority and that we don't have to, I was in a meeting in 2009 with top labor union heads, top think tank people, right after the Obama, and people in that room were all censoring themselves, saying, oh, we can't do that, we don't have 60 votes. And so if we're censoring ourselves, that says a lack of belief in our potential and our ability. But if we really believe that we actually have a majority and we have a social justice majority, our policy agenda can be much bigger and much bolder and much more inspiring. And that's, I think, the message that I want to be able to leave. There's so much that can be done. Some of the work that Van's organization is doing around this polluter pays tax in California, tied to the cap and trade, this offset piece, $400 million a year of that money is now going to disadvantaged communities in California. And that's because of the coalition and the belief in this majority to transform the public policies, the fight for 15. Then ultimately to be able to, and if we can have a conversation in this election where democratic socialist is a very legitimate conversation of what that viewpoint is, why can't we then actually have a conversation around wealth tax? A 2% tax on the top 1% in this country could end poverty. So let's have a conversation not about ameliorating this or making this piece of better here. Dr. King said the best way to end poverty is to end poverty.
Very, very good. A round of applause. Yeah, good.
Any policy change that can actually make it simpler for people to register to vote would be quite useful. So we really thought online voter registration could be that, a policy issue which actually makes it much more accessible and much easier. Well, this bore out true. 840,000 people registered in 37 days.
I think in politics, the first rule of engagement is showing up, right? So PowerPAC has demonstrated that they're not afraid or they're not overwhelmed about going into a place in a state or a local jurisdiction and engaging in politics and talking about issues that are sometimes hard to talk about in politics, and that's the confluence of race and ethnicity, building winning coalitions. I think that you have to give the organization tremendous credit to sort of think beyond the traditional politics and thinking about having a meaningful engagement that builds winning coalitions that can sustain themselves over time and not just be successful in one election cycle and then forgotten in the next cycle.
By working with PowerPAC over the last 4 years, we've been able to expand the electorate in Georgia. We've added seats, we've helped encourage more people of color to run for office, and we've been able to start to change the trajectory of Georgia.
If we can begin to make the transformations necessary in southern states like Texas and Georgia, Arkansas, this is the Archimedean leverage point that we need to transform politics in our country to a progressive politics, and I'm proud to be a part of this.
PowerPAC, happy 10 years of effective advocacy for social justice.
I think Barack Obama is a starting point. Our analysis has shown that there's at least 24 to 26 states that can do a lot of what we've done in California.
The future of U.S. politics lies, ironically,
in areas that have been most exploited historically. The hands that once picked cotton and the hands that once picked lettuce can now pick presidents and governors and senators.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. My name's Alita Garcia. I'm a part of the next generation of the Stanford Mafia. I wanted to thank Steve and, being newer to DC and trying to find a way in politics as a career, you tend to get angry when you care about people of color. And Steve and Susan in particular they sort of latched on to me. They saw my passion, and I just want to thank them for lifting up our voices, the youth's voices. So I'm going to talk a little bit about immigration reform. I currently work as the Director of Coalitions and Policy at Forward US, which is a 501c4 advocacy organization founded by Mark Zuckerberg about 1.5 years ago, trying to pass comprehensive immigration reform. But today my remarks are in my personal capacity, and more so through my experience in the 2012 cycle and now working on immigration reform, but previously as the National Latino Vote Deputy Director for President Obama's re-election. So my passion is in Latino civic engagement, and I don't believe that we should have 12 million people here not participating in our democracy and being exploited. So I wanted to sort of frame the conversation on immigration reform sort of where the progressive movement is completely failing, and I'm not going to hold back, as some of you in the room know my inclinations to be. So there's a huge difference in saying, we need to support immigration reform so that we get Latino votes in the fall, versus we need to actively push for reforming our broken immigration system to continue building our relationship with Latino voters who we value as human beings, and whom we admit we are not doing a good job at engaging civically, and they are vital to the health of our democracy. And so I think oftentimes we do the former versus the latter, so I'm going to be talking about the framework of the latter. And so often we get caught up in trying to win and building power, but what are we winning for? We're winning for the opportunity to enact policies. And so if we're not doing that, then we're just as bad as the other side. So I put up on Facebook a couple of days ago, I have the luxury of having been born in this country. I put up on Facebook, the people are asking the people who we're fighting for how they feel about Democrats and the progressives. And I got responses back from national leaders. These are people that are on television every day. These are people writing op-eds in all the national publication. These are people who have thousands of organizers following their lead. And here are the responses I got. As an individual directly impacted by our currently broken immigration system, I feel betrayed by progressive leaders. As someone that has gone through countless leadership opportunities, I feel that when it comes to building progressive leadership, we have lost a focus on diversity. I'm not a Republican, nor will I ever be conservative because I believe in progress, but I feel frustrated by a Democratic leadership that seems too scared to take action on this issue. The next one was, girl, I could write a whole essay, but over the years, I have become very disappointed to see the Democratic Party way more focused on using rhetoric to attract the Latino electorate instead of looking for real bipartisan solutions to the immigration mess that we currently have. And then lastly, the Democratic Party harbors as many anti-immigrants as Republicans do, though not as vocal, which adds urgency not to side with the party, but policies. Need I say more? And they linked to a memo from the current mayor of Chicago to the former president of the United States advocating for mass deportation and increased deportations to look tough on crime. So these are the sentiments of our leaders, of our youth. These are people who drive the national narrative. These are the future voters once these policies are enacted. These are people with US citizen voters and their families. And quite frankly, these are people who love this country so much that they're risking getting kicked out of this country to fight for the economic justice and fairness within their communities. These are people we want on our team. So where does that sort of transition to? In my opinion, we're sort of as a movement being lazy because of two things. We have short-term memory. So how many of us sort of remember generally where we were in 2010? You know, President Obama was president. I know generally where I was in 2010. So that was not that long ago. Democrats had control of everything and didn't pass the DREAM Act. So while we act like we support immigration reform, everybody that's a leader in the movement now watched Democrats fail the community 4 years ago. We have work to do to pick up sort of the belief in progressives valuing this community. And then secondly, it's just been easier because the other side is really good at saying really awful things. So, you know, I worked for the president, and when Mitt Romney calls for self-deportation and the SB 1070 should be the law of the land, it's much easier to run sort of, you know, an opposition campaign based on these statements, but we need to be backing it up. We need to be leaning in. And leaning in happens. You know, just an hour ago, a fabulous attorney general who I volunteered for 25 months, just enacted just sent out a memo saying, ICE detainers, local law enforcement, you might get sued. And that's leaning in. Leaning in is not letting dreamers get arrested in your office when they're staging a sit-in, trying to get you to call out the president on deportation. So I'm going to transition to the data really quickly, and this is to Andy's point. So there's this general meme in sort of bigger institutions in progressive politics that immigration reform is not an issue priority of voters, because when you do the polling and you stack it up against like a job or education, it's going to come out less. But to what Deepak was saying, we need to talk about immigration as it intersects to all of the policies. So as it intersects to economic justice and access to just the current minimum wage, forget raising it, just getting the current one we have now, or access to reproductive health. If there's a woman at a border who can't travel outside of El Paso because there's border checkpoints from the border to 100 miles in, and she can't get to a health clinic, that's a reproductive justice issue. So talking through that intersection. But just some quick numbers because, maybe my passion's not enough. So 64% of Latino voters are following the immigration reform debate. 71% of Latino voters say it is very or extremely important to pass comprehensive immigration reform in 2014. 83% say it'll be important in how they calculate their vote for Congress. And this is the most important part. 61% of Latino voters know an undocumented immigrant. And 30% of those, that undocumented immigrant is in their family. So while we're thinking, okay, Latino voters, they're not undocumented, obviously, because they're citizens and they can vote, we forget that this is far more integrated into the fabrics of our communities and how we're talking to the family unit and why that impacts for them going to the polls. And CAP just recently put out an awesome study sort of showing immigration as a fundamental part of the American Latino voter identity. So I wanted to give 2 data points. So immigrants and their children make up 49% of eligible, or made up 49% of eligible Latino voters in 1996. And by 2012, this climbed to 55%. Second generation immigrants are the driving force behind the growth of Latino electorate. So between 2012 and 2016, 3.3 million Latino citizens will turn 18, and 2 million of those are children of immigrants. So when we're talking about immigration reform and we're thinking we're only talking to the undocumented community, we're talking to our next set of voters, the rising American electorate's parents. That's who we're talking about. This is core to their identity, and it needs to be incorporated into our issue platform. So what are the politics? 49% of Latino voters have voted Republican at some point in time. 61% are open to listening to Republicans if they support immigration reform. And 53% will feel more favorable to Congress if Boehner allows immigration reform for a vote. So this is to show the opportunity that Republicans have in speaking to Latino voters once they get past immigration reform. But on the flip side, 3-to-1 margin, Latino voters will blame Republicans if immigration reform doesn't pass. So we get lazy at that fact too, because all of this is also shouldn't be perceived in a vacuum, because meanwhile, the president, who I've worked for 2 cycles, I love dearly, has deported 2 million people, and we need to get honest about that. So, and the numbers reflect that. In January of 2013, Latino support of President Obama from then to now has dropped from 67% to 44%. This is serious. This is because we're not stupid. This is because we're seeing what's happening in our communities. To wrap up, and I've lost track, we also have some past examples of this working. So Prop 187, SB 1070. Registration in Arizona has increased by 26% and turnout increased by 37% between 2008 and 2012. It's because there was this energy behind rebelling against anti-immigration policies. Harry Reid's vote in 2010, he got 90% of the Latino vote. In DACA in 2012 and what that did to excite the Latino electorate before November. So all this generally concluding to say, leadership matters. Leadership is not winning. Leadership is enacting policies. And Latinos as voters are not stupid, and they want to be talked to as whole individuals and an understanding of their communities, their families, and they're reading into that. And there's a lot of pain that's happened over the last 10 years, particularly on this issue. And progressives need to be at the table proactively fighting on this issue. So look forward to your questions. Thank you.
What they know about politics in America is that the president's at the top of the ticket, so if you vote for him, things should change. And what happens is when the world doesn't change, because we don't have enough market condos in Congress, when the world doesn't change because we don't have good governors, when the world doesn't change, they don't come back.
When you hear the word socialism, what do you think of that? Is that a positive or negative in your mind?
Right now, I think of it as more of a positive.
Millennials. Who are they? What do they believe? Why do we care? We visited a college campus to talk with some of these young, mysterious creatures who may hold the keys to the country's political future, and we asked for some help from Reason Foundation polling director Emily Eakins, who happens to be a millennial herself. Go ahead and mock Generation Selfie all you want, but Eakins says politicians and activists from all sides of the spectrum dismiss the millennials at their own peril.
There are three major reasons why we should care about the millennial generation. One, they're one of the largest generations we've seen in American history. Two, they're very diverse and we have a lot of new Americans in this generation. The third reason is that millennials came of a politically impressionable age during the post-9/11 era with ballooning government spending, two unpopular wars, and then the Great Recession. These are things that will forever impact their political judgments and their voting behavior even as they get older. And as a result, we want to understand what they think because that helps us understand how our politics will change in the future when they start to vote more.
How do you describe yourself politically? Liberal, conservative, something else?
No, I'm more liberal. I think liberal. I was usually leaning more liberal, but I guess it depends on the topic.
I've grown up in a very conservative household, so, but I've been open to a lot of liberal views.
What we're finding is that young Americans today are increasingly more comfortable using the word liberal than older Americans. In fact, they're twice as likely to self-identify as liberal and about half as likely to identify as conservative.
I don't really have a political affiliation, but I guess if you were to define it, it'd be a moderate between liberal and conservative.
Money-wise, I'm kind of a moderate, but social issues-wise, I'm pretty liberal.
A lot of people have prematurely concluded that young people are liberals. And that's actually not true. They're not liberals, they're social liberals. 62% self-identified as socially liberal, but only 49% said that they were economically liberal. So that average millennial you might talk to on the street is probably going to be a social liberal and pretty moderate on the economic issues.
Do you prefer Democrats or Republicans or neither?
I don't like the two-party system.
There's things I agree from one party that I don't agree with the other and vice versa, so I just have to really kind of figure out which one I'm more leaning towards.
Right now, it's neither. I'm kind of angry at both. I voted Democrat before for Obama election, but right now it just seems like a big old party, and they're kind of working or conniving together.
Young people are 3 times as likely as Americans over 30 to self-identify as politically independent. A third of them say no. They don't lean towards either of the two major political parties. Both the Democratic and Republican parties will need to take note of young people. Democrats may feel that they kind of have the millennial generation in their pockets, and that is not accurate.
Why do you think that is, that people around this age just don't trust either party?
They get a lot of their information on the internet. There's a lot that comes to light, so you can see the inconsistencies.
Obama said, oh, we're going to get out of all these wars, we're going to stop doing these things. A lot of people were like, that's a good idea. We don't need to be wasting our time in battles that are pointless. And then, lo and behold, we're still doing all the same things. So
even though Obama said he was going to try and take the troops out, I don't think that's enough.
Young people